for being here this evening to share this very special and important day with me. Chapa, play it too. You all make me happy. In the tradition of the Cote Salish people, I raise my hands to all of you in thanks. I am deeply humbled to be standing here today. Tseshaht. I am from the Tseshaht First Nation, as my chief explained, as my elder explained, is one of the many linguistic 14, 15 linguistically related groups coming under the name of Nuuchahnulth, a name that means all along the mountains and sea. Our traditional territories are on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and I was born and raised in my community of Tseshaht. When I was raised with the understanding of the importance of our whaling culture and of our whaling identity. And as my elder Willard Gallek explained, our name is attached to that tradition. The name Tseshaht. Whales and whalers were central and still are central to many of our stories and our legends, which are kept alive through our oral tradition, being passed down from one generation to the next. When I was a young girl, I used to hear many different stories from the storyteller in our family, my wonderful grandfather, the late Huey Watts. I have very vivid memories of these times. Of my grandfather sitting in the living room of his home and having all of us lean, please, my auntie Miss Fun. All of us sitting there, my sisters, my brother, listening to my grandfather, and they can picture his image, but I'm going to give his image to you. This beautiful man with this, always had his gray hair cut short in this buzz cut. Always had a blue t-shirt. I can't remember what you call these t-shirts that he always liked to wear, like a Long John's t-shirt. Usually had a little hole in it somewhere. His brown trousers and his moccasin slippers. And he'd be sitting in his recliner, getting ready to read. And he would get this look on his face that he knew he was going to tell us a story. Beautiful story. And he had this way when he would talk and his eyes would sparkle. And he'd click his teeth. I don't still understand how he did that, but he would click his teeth and start telling us these stories. And he would read from a book. A lot of times he would tell us these stories, but he pulled stories from a book. Little did I know back then as a young girl what he was doing and how he was keeping our traditions and cultures alive. Because the stories he was reading to me were stories, the stories he was reading to us were stories that were put in a book, that were gathered in the early 1900s, and they were stories that were gathered by the linguist anthropologist Edward Sapir, and they were my great-great-grandfather Sayachapas's stories. And there was my grandfather passing this down to us. And so he used to pick up this book, which back then the first publication was orange. And all I remember, he used to have this orange book. Never knew what the book was. And he would start reading. And the interesting thing with Sapir, what he did, and which is why I felt it was important to use Sapir in my work, Sapir not only wrote the stories, wrote what he was collecting, what he was gathering for our people, leaving this for our people. He wrote it in English and he also wrote it in our language. My grandfather used to sit there and try to read, a man who didn't have the opportunities that we have today, the educational opportunities, and he sat there and tried to read those words. And to this day, I feel so blessed that I have that in my life. Our whaling ancestors continued to breathe life. The spirits of these ancestors, they breathe life into these rich whaling narratives. They're preserved and reinforced through our oral traditions. They give power to our drums. They support the songs, the voices that you heard today of my family. They are there when we dance and when we perform our songs and when we conduct our ceremonies. They guide the hands of our artists as they masterfully create the powerful images of thunderbird, whale, and lightning serpent. In this book, I explain how revitalizing our whaling tradition has cultural, social, and spiritual significance, reaffirming our identities as whaling people. Whaling held economic importance as well as spiritual and prestige significance in both the Makah and Nuuchahnulth cultures and societies. Stories that we have, very important stories contained in this oral tradition, talk about Likin, the thunderbird, and how he brought the whale to our communities so that we could feast on this bounty. We have stories about great whaling Hawe, our chiefs, who spent years physically, mentally, and spiritually preparing for that whale hunt, for that amazing hunt. After a whale was caught, it was brought to the community and divided up among all the people so that everyone could share. Until the late 1920s, whaling was a very important component of both the Makah and Nuuchahnulth groups, cultures, and economies, and was intertwined in this intricate web of social interactions that constructed our identities. However, by the early 1920s, well, by the turn of the century, most of the whales that we hunted, the gray whale and the humpback whale, were hunted to near extinction by the commercial whaling industry that grew here in the Pacific Northwest. As the whales declined, so did our whale hunts. And as that changed, everything in our worlds at this time were changing. The loss of the whaling also meant a weakening of many of those social elements that were integral to that tradition. This was happening simultaneously as the US and Canadian governments were imposing their policies on us that were further weakening our societies. This was a time when we underwent major cultural change. When investigating Indigenous cultures and the impact non-Native contact had on our societies, many non-Native scholars focus on the cultural disruption, the breaking down of the societies and the traditions. In this book, I focus on cultural continuity. I illuminate how even though our societies faced tragic policies, disease epidemics, federal education policies that took away our children, that undermined our languages, we are still here. The thread that connects us to our past has been twisted, it has been turned, it has been stretched, it has never broken. Beginning in the Beginning in the 1950s and 60s, we began experiencing a cultural revitalization in Indigenous communities throughout the world. And our revival of our whale hunts are part of that. An effort to become self-determining nations. to revitalize our cultures in a way that we see fit, to revitalize the traditions that make us who we are, that are important and significant to who we are as a people. The whaling is a part of that cultural revival. It's also part of this process of decolonization and has become a strategy for enriching and strengthening not only our cultures, but our identities as whaling people. We do not need whales to subsist on. But whales and whaling are more than just a food source. They have there's spirituality connected to whaling and to that tradition. And also, when we look at communities, especially what has happened as a result of boarding school, many of our communities are facing very serious health issues. And we see the return to this very rich and important food source as helping alleviate some of those problems. I have received great encouragement throughout the years, not only from my family, but from my Tseshaht community, from my Haweh, my chiefs, from the Nuu-chah-nulth Nation. And for this, I am very grateful. My deep appreciation also goes out to the Makah, to the many Makah who came forward to tell me their stories, who were there to, who always were ready and willing to share with me the knowledge, their knowledge. To all of you, Kleko, I hope with this book to humbly give something back to you. I want to make it clear as I stand here, I do not speak for the Makah people. I do not speak for the Nuuchahnulth people. My research and my analysis is grounded in my own experiences growing up in a whaling culture and growing up in my Tseshaht community. My knowledge comes from the family I was born into and the community I was raised in. My education comes from my elders, my relatives, the people who are very important to me. The words I write come from these people and from the spirits of those relatives who passed, our ancestors who guided my hands and my heart throughout this whole process. As a scholar, I strive to present a study that is comprehensive and critically and academically rigorous, but at the same time being sensitive to the Makah and the Nuu-chah-nulth communities and to be respectful of these people, my people. My goal in writing this book was to provide an understanding of our whaling tradition through the utilization of written and archival material and archaeological data, balancing these with our own stories, our family stories, our Tseshaht stories, our Nuu-chah-nulth stories, our Makah stories. And through this process, I learned many things. The writing of this book was both rewarding and also very challenging and very deeply personal. I found the experience to be rewarding because I was writing about something that was so important to us. It became an act of resistance, an act of re-empowerment. As I mentioned earlier, there's wonderful material that has been written about the Nuu-chah-nulth by non-Indians. In fact, I found the material that I read invaluable. Research that linguists and anthropologists and historians have conducted with my people, especially in the early 1900s, and the work that Edward Sapir did in our communities, along with the linguist Morris Swadish, left valuable information for us. I use Edward Sapir a lot, and I'm proud that we have this material, these notes, these texts that he left, because when I read them, I think about how he sat with my great-great-grandfather Sayachikas and gathered this information.